Thank you for the invitation, Maxine and Saskia. It's really appreciated. You'll see that I've slightly changed the title, but it's really the same presentation. My name's Leanne Norman. I work up here in the Carnegie School of Sport at Headingley campus, and I have the pleasure of directing our Centre for Social Justice in Sport and Society. So we're one of 6 centres and institute here in the school. We rebranded, repurposed about 3 years ago, just literally a month before the pandemic hit. So I always say it's unfortunate timing, good timing, I'm not sure. But we were the Centre for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. So we have been around for decades, but we rebranded a few years ago. And that was really the purpose of that was to shift the conversation on these issues. I'm sure that you may feel the same, but certainly for our team and I, we don't feel that EDI's got that. It is not having the impact that it should be having. And in fact, if anything, we're seeing an EDI fatigue, really, particularly in the sports organisations with which we work. It's very siloed. And in some ways, I think I don't know, it seems to be pushing people away, I think, in a kind of a loose way. So we wanted to shift that conversation. We wanted to reimagine the centre to be more inclusive of people within the centre as well, and to represent who was in the room with this reimagined membership. So you'll see here at the bottom, along the bottom right there, our 4 principal research themes within the centre. Identities and inequalities, children, young people and families research, management and governance, and disabled sport and adaptive physical activity. So that's the website on the university page. You know, if you've got 5 minutes over a cup of tea, feel free to have a look round. And in terms of with whom we work in the centre, and principally within that, so within the centre, I of course lead the centre, and then we have a programme of research that we're going to talk about today, which is improving gender equity in sport coaching and leadership. And a key part of that work, a key feature that I'll talk about probably throughout, is working with the people that can make the change. These are some of our partners with whom we currently work or we've worked with recently. Principally governing bodies and sport councils, but universities, etc. Of course, they're part of it. But really a key feature of our work is working alongside, co-creating, co-producing the research to ensure it has the impact and the change that it has to have, and that it doesn't sit on the dusty shelf somewhere. So these are some of our partners with whom we work, and that's intentional and deliberate feature of the research. So just to give you a little bit of background to the presentation this morning, which will probably be about 45 minutes, is really just to give you so a sense of purpose of the research. So this talk will be around presenting the programme of work on gender equity in sport coaching. I'll talk a little bit more about why we do the research within the wider context of sport. Why is this work so important? Why is it needed? Then within that, the approach that we've taken to the research and the significance of the research and the significance of the impact that it's had as well. Why it looks like it does in terms of the research. And then finally, to talk a bit more then on the impact of our research. We're very proud that we were recently awarded a 4-star in the REF exercise for our impact case study on improving gender equity in sport workforces. So I'll talk a little bit more about what that impact looked like. So and if at any point that you want to ask questions or discuss anything, please feel free to just stick your hand up. I can see you all, so that's, you know, that's handy, so I can see. I know sometimes we do these things and it suddenly just vanishes and I'm just talking to myself. So it's lovely to see you all, lovely to meet you. And so please feel free to just stop at any point, of course. So you'll see down the side here, without wanting to sound like a politician, this is a little bit of our manifesto, I guess. of the research program on improving gender equity in sport coaching within the centre, what it's about, how we work. It's a little bit of this manifesto. So the work is really, and simplistically, I suppose, is challenging and asking questions around who our workforce is, who's represented within our workforce, who isn't, where are they represented in the system, the pathway in, through, staying in the pathway is really important. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Often the focus of organisations is really about just asking who's in the workforce. We're not very good at doing that. So we then don't track people in, through, and how do we keep people? And within that, of course, is asking who, but improving the experiences of people in the system is really important. Again, often you'll see with organisations, a lot of the focus is getting people through the door and in through the door. And then that focus seems to drift once they're in the door. And actually, how do we keep people? How do we improve experiences? And I'll share some stories from participants as well that really demonstrate how difficult it is to work in sport. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. I think the key feature for me is, and what makes the research stand out perhaps from other work, and this is a whole team, this isn't just me, is the focus on the cultural and the systemic. And really the work is about challenging and bringing about systemic change. If we're really going to see change that sticks in terms of who our workforce is, we need a different approach. What we've done in the past hasn't worked, and that's because really we haven't challenged the culture and the systems in which we work. The peripheral, I guess, wrappings around our coaches often and again, I will talk about this, but the focus is very much on the women in this case. So it's that fix the women approach without addressing the system. Again, I will talk about how we've done that in terms of utilising multidisciplinary approaches and working with partners to bring about the change. I recognise I can't go into a governing body and address change or strengthen what they're doing. But what we can do is work with people, and that's through raising awareness, producing critical knowledge, and working with them that tackles the problem, but also tackles what they need to do as well, and recognising where they're at as a governing body. So that's a little bit of our manifesto. Do sound like a politician, I must stop saying that. So the purpose of the research: why do we do what we do, and what are some of the problems, in inverted commas, that we are addressing? And I just want you to take a few seconds to read these two different stories. They're from two different separate high performance female coaches working in the UK. And I'm just interested for a few seconds, if you want to just take your mic off, and just, what are some of your reflections on that in terms of what are you reading when you read those stories? How do you feel? What are some of the issues that stick out at you? What are your reflections briefly on these two different stories? Does anybody feel comfortable in sharing?
Yeah. When I read the first one, my initial thought, having both coached and gone to conferences as an academic, was what an awful place to be, because I don't think I've ever worried about my safety when I've gone to a conference. Then when you read the second one, you go, dear God, that's nowhere even close to even being an overreaction.
Yeah.
That's disgusting.
Yeah.
And I think it makes me realize, I think we're very lucky and protected at times in academia. I don't think it's often I say that about the profession, but that kind of harassment is just outrageous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's my polite word for it.
Thanks for your diplomacy. Does anyone else have similar reflections or different reflections?
Yeah, I'll go. The second one sadly didn't surprise me that much. And I think that's like, when I read it, I was like, oh, I'm not surprised by this. I'm a football player and I captain a team. And just this weekend, we had a coach on the other sideline who was saying to his players, like, oh, if you score another goal, like, you'll get a kiss from me, darling. That was his line to his team, you know? So I think that, like, I'm not surprised that, you know, women in that space doing the same jobs as men are being treated the way that other women in that space at all levels are treated. In some ways, I'm like, probably having a power position means that at times it's more punitive.
Yeah, the danger, particularly with the second story, and these are high performance female coaches. Not that the level matters, but these are our highest, these are Olympic coaches, and particularly for the second one, that the perpetrator of that was the most influential male coach and probably person in that governing body at the time. So he had a lot of power and he influenced a lot of decisions. And this was one incident of a few. And because of our research, jumping ahead to impact, but because of our research, that person has now been suspended indefinitely from sport. So that's our work contributed to that legal case, to his lifetime suspension. But the reason and thank you both for your reflections, and I saw, you know, people nodding, so there's obviously something landed here. The reason I include these stories quite regularly is not to shock, but the point is often EDI and the work that we do is seen as something additional to have in an organisation, and it's something nice and it's something we think about after all the other core business has happened. And I share these stories to really hope that it lands with people to redefine what we think of as when we think of gender equity or EDI, that it's something more than just something nice to have, that it should be what we consider every day within our organisations, and that it is more than just having additional women or more women, 10% more women. You know, I hear this mantra, we need more women, in this case, different groups of women, but it's just generally just more women in relation to this. But actually, this runs deeper than this. This is about feeling safe at work. Helen, you talked about that. This is psychological safety, physical safety, and these examples. And I think also with sport, we normalise a lot of these incidents and these stories, and we don't problematise this enough. And actually, there's a point where I want our work to say this is not okay. It's not okay, like Helen, you said, go to work and feel like this. But we're asking our coaches to go through that. As well as everything else. So thank you for sharing your reflections. So just to broadly summarise, these are some of the issues I'm going to talk about. These are some of the problems that we're trying to tackle within our research, and I'll go through them one by one. So as you'll see, the context is really important. Sport is not a level playing field, and that's nothing new to tell you on the call, and that's nothing new when I stand up and talk about these issues. Sport is not a level playing field. People are not arriving at the door on equal terms. It still matters who you are, where you're from, what your parents do, what the colour of your skin is, what your sexual orientation is, what your age is, what your gender is, what your disability is, or ability. All of these issues still matter, still shape and still determine who enjoys sports, who succeeds in sport, and who reaches the top of the pathway or reaches positions of power. So we're not all arriving equally, and sport continues to be played and participated on uneven playing fields. And you only need to look at our leadership to know that sport is not a meritocracy, and we can never claim that purely if we just looked at who leads it. And in terms of the stories within sport, we are seeing a proliferation of more social justice issues. Of course, they've been there, but what we're seeing is a rise of that storytelling. And we're seeing it in the press almost daily. If you go to the press, I'm sure that you'll see the news. These stories are almost in there every single day, a different social justice issue. And so what we are seeing greater coverage and reporting of social justice issues. And like I said, they have always been there, but the difference is that, we are seeing with that a rise in athlete activism, and people, rather than being afraid to talk about these things because they'll lose sponsorship or lose that, impact their image, we're actually seeing athletes being pushed to talk about this, or being encouraged to talk about these issues, perhaps by their sponsors, or at least feeling that they can take the lead on talking about these issues. These are some stories from athletes taken from our research, that when we talk to them about the impact of an inclusive workforce, diversity within their coaching, within their coaches, does it matter? Do you see it? Does it impact you? Because I think there's also this conflation with EDI in sport, that it doesn't impact performance, that it is no direct impact, that athletes don't notice it, that they're only concerned with playing or competing and winning, and everything else is secondary. So when we talk to these athletes who are Olympic athletes or high performance athletes, and they're not just, for example, not just Yasmin, who's a Black woman, who identifies as a Black woman, we're talking to white, non-disabled male athletes who would, people would consider privileged, that it impacts them. And you can see that when you're talking to them. So we've talked to coaches in athletics that have had their accreditation stripped of them if they're women. So they're not allowed to enter the field of play. They're not allowed to go to competitions because they haven't got the accreditations, because it's the male coaches that have been given the accreditations for the competitions. So what you're saying is, in this case, Andy, Aidan, Yasmin, you're going to go to a competition on Saturday without your coach that you work with day in and day out, and not for it to be impacting your performance or your well-being or your development. So athletes, the point of this, I guess, is to say that athletes notice it, that there's a rise in athlete activism, their voices are louder than ever before, and that diversity and inclusion amongst sport workforces matters to them, which sometimes is news to the governing bodies with whom we talk. In terms of representation, so we talked a bit there about context. So what we've got, this proliferation of social justice issues, greater reporting of social justice issues. We also have, of course, the issue of representation, actually visually, who is in our workforce, who are our athletes. And this graphic is from the IOC. You'll see along the top there, that's female athletes at the Olympic Games. And you'll see that steady increase to parity across the Games. From London up to Paris is going to be 50-50 in terms of athletes. And we're getting there with the Winter Games as well. Then we don't see that mirrored in who our coaches are. And you'll see then that graphic at the bottom, female coaches at the Olympic Games and the Winter Games. What that story doesn't show you, but we can tell you, is that Olympic cycle going all the way back, Sydney, even further back, that figure of 11% has not changed. So we're in what I would say a state of inertia. Nothing's moving, nothing's shifting. So something, whatever we're doing, isn't shifting. Now, going forward to Paris, UK Sport have recently announced that they will have 25% of their coaches to be women. That's a huge jump. And in 6 months, I doubt very much that they've tackled the problem. So I believe that what they're doing is just giving out more accreditations so that they can tell the story that they've, upped the game. Now, of course, we have to look at who's making those decisions as well. And these are figures from UK Sport. They're the most recent. And our data, we're not very good in the UK at collecting data around who our workforce is. I had an email even yesterday from UK Coaching to say that they're going on an interview on Radio 4 that they need to say about how many women they've got. Do I have those statistics? And I had to politely say, I think you're better placed than I am to have those statistics as the UK, UK Coaching. So, but what this data shows me, it tells me several stories. One of them is that we're not good at collecting data, but that when we do, the data tends to do this rather than talking to each other. that intersectional data is not there. But however, we work with what we've got, and you can see who makes our decisions, who is likely to make our decisions sitting on the boards. Gender, we're definitely getting there, but then when you really drill down into that, we are talking about white, non-disabled, heterosexual women from middle-class backgrounds. We've got research from Sport Scotland that when they were pushing for gender parity on boards, that suddenly there was this huge increase. And when they drilled down into that, what they found was that boards were adding additional seats to their tables effectively. So instead of having a 12-person board, they were then having a 15-person board and giving those 3 spaces to women, and so they could report greater representation. So there's probably, and you'll probably find the women then they're representing the Women's Committee. So there's some little dark arts going on there, I suppose, as well. But so that's the data in terms of who leads our sport. The key of that is, of course, they make the decisions, who our workforce is, what our policies are. What that data tells us, if we were to show it in an image, I guess, is to say that, in a word, it's imbalanced in favour of all groups of men, and some groups of men more than others. And this isn't about saying that men are the issue, and I'm always very keen to say that, because it's about masculinity, it's about power, it's about other issues within organisations. But in a nutshell, it favours all groups of men, and it leaves us with a very imbalanced coaching and leadership workforce. So that's that in a summary in terms of the representational issue. Like I said, one additional problem that we are trying to tackle is, like I said at the start, is what happens when you get people in the door. That's often the focus of governing bodies. We want more, we want more. A key, really big issue that we're starting to see is this huge drop off between the levels on the pathway, particularly in coaching, within coaching. And what we see on average is that we lose 90% of our female coaches in this case from levels 1 to 4 or 5, depending on whatever pathway that the sport has. That's greater for women than it is men. Of course, you have a drop off of occupation, of course you do, of levels. But what we see in sport for women compared to men is more acute, and progression is lower and slower. So this is a case study from recent work that we did in athletics. And what you'll see there is the levels 1 to 4, they have a 4-level structure. And you'll see then the total number of coaches qualified, total number of female coaches within that pool compared to men, and then that percentage relates to the percentage of that level that are female coaches. I often find that we start with quite good numbers at level 1. We've got something to play with. We have that pool, but that drop off is just, it's quite drastic. Another example here is from a different sport, a very big sport in the UK. And we've got fantastic numbers at level 1, almost 8,000 women. That is still only 10% of our workforce, but we lose 99% of those coaches, of those women in that system. And then within the women that are there in the system, only 5% are active anyway. So focusing on getting people in the door isn't enough on its own. And we work with governing bodies at different points, different what I call trapdoors, to find out what are the trapdoors, what are those critical windows, and why are they so pertinent at that point. The problem with that, with these issues, and I've talked about numbers quite a bit at the moment, and they do have some weight when we stand with organisations, but I think organisations get that now, and they see that. That's changed over the course of the time that I've been doing this work, leading this research. Numbers are an issue, of course, by themselves, because if you have a proliferation of one social group, in this case of predominantly white, non-disabled, middle-class men in an occupation, it enhances the masculine identity of that occupation. So men's numerical dominance will then serve to couch that occupation in that identity. So that's one issue of having too many men. But what really troubles me particularly, and we've shared this already as a group at the start with those stories, are the stories that we hear from women coaches. That's what keeps me awake at night, those patterns of exclusion that sit across sports. And while we're getting better, we're not so good at it at the moment. We're getting better at, across the research, the more contextualized, nuanced understanding of a particular sport for how it shapes women's experiences. The stories are broadly the same in terms of course, exclusion and inequalities are patterns. And this is a summary of some of the themes within the stories that we hear from women coaches. We talk to women at all points of the pathway. Their stories are very similar from level 1 to 4 or 5. Some then become more pertinent than others in terms of contractual status is really important. I'll talk a bit more about that. But identity, intersectional identity is really important. So the themes that I've starred are particularly pertinent for Black women coaches and or women that identify as disabled. For example, isolation is more pertinent for disabled women coaches. Low job security is more pertinent for Black women coaches. But then across the piece, we see these shared collective stories across the reports from women. And then when we drill further down into hearing some of these stories, and I've shared now some of these stories that we do hear from women coaches. And the reason I'm sharing this is really to demonstrate the complexity of this problem. And this is why I share with governing bodies, and I'll talk then a bit more about the governing bodies. But then to bring these themes to life, I just wanted to share then a few of these stories that we hear. And just pick one or two or however many you feel able to read. And the reason, like I said, the reason I share this, and I share these with governing bodies, is to show the juxtaposition really of the complexity of the problem, how it's felt and how it's played out, how it manifests in the day-to-day. So we talk about gender equity, and sometimes it's just thrown around. Some people can't, but we work with, understandably, gender equity isn't a phrase that lands, not sure about what it means. But then when we say, well, this is what it looks like, this is how it feels like, inequity will feel like, then when we match that to what the governing bodies are telling us what gender equity is, you can see then the difference in understanding the problem. I often use the analogy of the lion's den, because if you were to follow this definition of gender equity and put more women on a coaching course, which is, I remember one governing body saying for us that we've added 3 more women onto a coaching course. If you remember the story at the start, you would think effectively you're throwing these women into a lion's den if it's not safe, and you've got somebody there who's sexually harassing women. That's just more women for him to harass in that way. Until we address the systemic and the cultural issues, a lot of sports are not safe, psychologically and physically safe for women. And I talk a lot about the dark side of coaching, and don't get me wrong, there are lots of positives about coaching, but we want to share these stories so that it can be an even better profession for those women. We talk to women that have left. I spoke to a woman 3 weeks ago that had left being a barrister to be a high performance coach. I spoke to a woman that was a cancer nurse that has left to become a high performance coach. Those hours on the grass, as the coaches would say, that work with the athletes to see that pedagogical development, is, to use the words of one coach, a drug. and it keeps people coaching. So I guess our work is really about how can we remove all the other stuff around the edges to make it even better, and really get to the heart of the complexity of the issue. So they're the stories that we hear from women, but equally we also listen to the stories of women. And these are some of the stories that circulate within our sport organisations. These are all quotes taken from our research. And we ask them the question, tell me what are some of the stories told within your governing body, your sport, your club, about women. The problem here, if you read some of these quotes, you can hear a gender difference. The gender difference underpins these narratives. Women are more emotional, which by implication means that men are less emotional, more assertive, better at working with, blah, blah, you know, more studious, they arrive on time, they're confident. This gender difference underpins these narratives. And why we have these stories and the why we ask these questions is because it means, in this case, sport coaching won't ever be seen in gender neutral ways. So we hear the thing, well, it's the best person for the job. We don't see gender. Well, you're creating blind spots in the current culture because it means you won't see coaching in a gender neutral way. And these stories are dangerous within our organisations because they construct what we know about coaching. They become our truths, our reality. They're social practices in themselves that are born out of the social context. So we have a lot of work to do to unravel those stories that we hear. And I'll talk a bit more about why they're significant within our governing body. So to bring this section to a close, the program of research that we have within the centre is about tackling, I guess, the misdiagnosis of gender equity. Often what we see, the representation, we would deal with the lack of women by fixing women, adding more women in, we'll sort this out, we'll do this and this. They're symptoms of a problem, they're not the problem themselves. So there's been this misdiagnosis in sport organisations, I think, around tackling the problem. So then often how we define the problem is then how we solve or attempt to solve the problem. And that's the approach our organisations take. So it then becomes, well, we need to fix the women. And that's why nothing seems to be changing very quickly. And nothing seems to stick for very long. Of course, there are other issues in terms of like funding cycles, mindsets, other issues as well. So we're trying to tackle within the centre this misdiagnosis of the problem. And these, just to recap, are some of the problems that we've just discussed. So for the final second half now, just talk a little bit more about our approach and the impact that our research has had. What we've seen, and this is to use Elia Mayerson's framework around tackling gender equity in organisations, we see these frameworks utilised by sport governing bodies, and what they tend to do is 3 different frameworks here. So the most popular one, of course, is either fix the women or it's creating equal opportunities. So we will give out coaching bursaries in this case. We're giving more opportunities for women to access the system in the same way that men do, or we fix the women. So we see, for example, coaching confidence courses and women only courses, which of course is not really tackling why you would need a women only course in the first place, or putting women onto something, or valuing the feminine. So we hear talking a lot about women's ways of coaching and celebrating that more nurturing approach, and should we be coaching in a more nurturing feminine style, which I absolutely agree that we need a more caring approach in coaching. The dangers of taking one of these frameworks is that they don't tackle the problem by themselves. Together, we would have much more success. And within our group, within our team, we, like I've said, we're trying to tackle the culture and the systems around the coaches in the first place. because then it doesn't really matter that this is women. This is going to affect everybody, and at some point, this is about a culture that your face doesn't fit, and so at some point that's going to impact everybody. So our work, like I say, is tackling the cultural and the systemic, and we take what we've called a dual approach. We don't want to lose sight of gender equity. We don't want to hide that this is about addressing gender equity, but we understand and we meet organisations where they are, and that's a really important mantra that we have within the programme of work, is that we meet organisations where they are. For example, I work with a very big governing body that I'd say are quite transformational in their thinking. The issue is what then they do is a challenge, but the thinking is very different to when I worked with a governing body recently that are still talking to me about the females and working with the females. And there's no judgment attached to that, because that's where they're at and on their journey. So we have to meet people where they are and what their strategic priorities are, because if it's going to have impact and they're going to endorse the work, then it has to be in line with what they're doing. But it's reframing the problem of gender. It's not an individual characteristic, a women's issue. It's not even about discrimination, but it's a systemic issue. It's the organisation is gendered. Sport is gendered itself. The organisations are inherently gendered. And when you look at it that way, then everything we do, and we look at policies, practices, values, ways in which work is structured, nothing is inconsequential, because the organisation is gendered. And therefore, gender isn't then an outcome, but it's a process by which then we have these differential experiences and different organisations. So that's our kind of guiding principles of our work, the way that we conceptualise gender. And I'll talk a bit briefly then, and I won't spend too much time on this, but in terms of just to give you a bit of a broad brush of some of the research, its contribution, I think firstly, the strength of the work that we've done, we've taken a critical feminist approach largely within the research, because we wanted to take a different turn from what has predominantly been a liberal sociological approach in this field to women and in sport coaching. There wasn't much emphasis on the cultural, the structural. It's largely North American. So I think only 7% of our research is from, I want to say, Europe, and I think largely predominantly then that is our research within that. And through that work, that has shifted, or helping to shift, the focus to the structural and how that connects to personal, rather than just on lived experiences of women by themselves, which of course are very important. And through that, and through the research, focusing on the organisations, the structures, we've been able to document what are some of the broader cultural issues within the organisations that they then may prop up this inequity. So you will see, for example, largely a performance narrative, metrics-based culture. If you think about tennis coaching, to be a qualified high-performance tennis coach, you have to perform. You have to be able to play the sport, and you have to play at a very good level. So, I mean, I would never be a very good tennis coach, but I understand the sport, but I can't play it. But then you get into the ideas of, well, who makes the best players and the best coaches, and that sort of narrative. It's about medals. I mean, it's really interesting. UK Sport have got their new motto is winning and winning well. Why do you need the winning and? Can we just have winning well? But so there's still this performance, metrics based, getting more medals, that then override this ethic of care within organisations. And there's still this idea, to pick another one, gender equals women's issues. So these gendered ideas still prop up our organisations, which then shape how we tackle the problem of gender equity. The research as well, it's really important that we've adopted a multidisciplinary perspective. So I work very closely with our psychologists here in the Carnegie School of Sport, which is why when Maxine and Saskia asked me to speak. I'm not a psychologist, but I work very closely with, for example, Faye Didymus here in the school around our work with well-being. We have defined that in a sociological way, but then also looking at it from a psychological point of view. And through that work in particular around well-being, we highlighted the impact of sport and coaching on different women's experiences. Remember I said about disabled women coaches feeling more isolated. The workers also through the psychology work and the well-being, we found that contractual status had a huge relationship in terms of women's well-being. And through that work then we've been able to tailor interventions and support governing bodies to tailor their interventions based on, and not then just looking at women as a homogenous group. And through the work, again, through the psychology work, it's really showcased women's purpose and value. So through one large study that we did, survey, was that the results showed that women's motivation and engagement levels as coaches was higher than women from other professions, for example, nursing, business, law. So the message was, you've got a really motivated, engaged workforce. Can you imagine what you get from that workforce if you really harness that? You don't need to instill it. Somebody in the team works with the fire and the police departments, and they spend a lot of time just instilling that motivation in people. You don't need to with a lot of our coaches. They're there and they're committed and they want to do the job. And so through that work then we've shown, and I talk about isolation, we've identified through the psychological research that isolation was a key stressor for women working in sport. And then what that then means, isolation, of course, coaching is a really lonely job. I was speaking to someone the other day, he's a performance director, so it's slightly different, but his job is 200 days away a year. That's huge for anybody. And then, of course, what we would have poor experiences of horizontal and vertical relationships, which make it very isolating within the profession. And that's been through our psychological research in this area, through our sociological research, particularly using Foucault, understanding discursive power, so how men and women are talked about in the organisation, sovereign power, the amount of power that football organisations, in this case was football associations, wield in terms of setting the rules, setting the rules of the game, educating coaches, coupled with biopower, so our ideas of women and men's bodies. That enmeshment of that power, entanglement of power, was really highlighted in our research, and it just shows that one simplistic mentoring program, for example, is just not going to tackle these issues by themselves. And of course, then they regulate women's behaviours and appearances. All of this is underpinned by what I would say is a non-compliant sporting environment. Sport gets away with this because we mark our own homework. We don't have a regulator. And so we see a proliferation of non-compliant policies. The story at the start with the man that was sexually harassed, that coach, they have no policy for selecting coaches. They have no formal policy. So it's down to that man and two other men that sit round and decide who's going to be our Olympic coaches. Well, it was coupled with the ideas that we have about men and women and the imbalance of power. You can see how those abuses happen often. And finally, the contribution then of the work is we've evaluated existing interventions as well in these spaces. So again, we work with a lot of governing bodies. There are so many programs and initiatives in this space, and our work has just worked alongside these governing bodies to say what works well, what perhaps needs tweaking, and has underpinned a large part of some of these interventions. So I just talk then finally, the last part is just to talk more about that impact itself. I mean, these are some of the questions we ask regularly ourselves as a team when we build impact into our thinking from day dot when we work with governing bodies. You know, what we're going to change here? What needs to be the priority? What other levers of change we're going to pull on to have that deep level change? And then what's it going to look like if it works? What does success look like for this governing body? And again, we're asking these questions with the governing bodies, with the organisations, because they need to own this and grow this themselves. And the first step really is understanding reality. That's always our first step as a team. What we see often is sports organisations positioning themselves as systems that prioritise inequalities, tackling injustices, but really without repositioning our system. So we say that we are tackling inequalities, but what we don't see is the system repositioning itself to be able to do that. And in that way, it's really like tinkering with the deck chairs on the Titanic. Unless you reposition yourself to set yourself up to tackle injustices, you're not going to be able to do that. Without tackling, what we see is organisations, this has skipped forward a little bit, what we see are organisations putting in place strategies, policies, what we don't tackle enough in sport to really get to the heart of it, which is what our programme of work is about, is those stories, are the relationships, how do things get done in the organisations, like those three men that decide the coaching policy. You've got a policy or a book somewhere, I'm sure, about coaches who get selected. I'm sure that it's in a desk somewhere, but really, how do things get chosen here, and tackling that, and where and what do we change? So this is Meadows' model of system change. Often we see sports tinkering around the edges, the parameters, the numbers, the changing in the workforce. They pull on that lever, like I said, adding more women in, changing the numbers in our workforce. That's the dominant approach to tackling gender equity in sport coaching. But of course, with levers, you can pull them in the wrong way. And like I said, growing the workforce at any cost, and there's no jobs, for example, for people to go into, or they're not safe environments, is going to have the opposite effect. So really, our work is about tackling the paradigms, the ideas that are used to design the system, that underpin the system, the power that underpins those systems, and the way that the system's organised. So just to bring this together, these are our four kind of areas, I guess, that we presented in our REF case study about where we've impacted the most. And we couched it in a UK, principally a UK issue, to really showcase the significance of the work. We've worked with the FA, for example, for about 8 years now. Over the course of those 8 years, we've worked on a number of projects and getting involved with strategy, working with the people that can make the change, for example, the head of workforce, head of FA learning, and for their game plan for growth, we tackled this objective, which was increasing the number of women and the diversity of women. And this was just a quote from the head of the head of workforce at the time. Because of our research, they reshaped the department. They've now got 16 people recruited to tackle inequalities in sport coaching. So they restructured the department to have that, like Audrey said, to have that razor sharp focus. And more broadly, the research has led to restructuring. We couched it in a shift in thinking, which of course is what we need to tackle first. To be more intentional, to be more proactive, and then to change the offer that the governing bodies offer towards tackling this issue. I think the key thing with the FA, which is what we battle with, we struggle with, is that what is their influence? Because they don't appoint people into clubs, they don't put people in employment. So what's the sphere of influence, I guess, here? So that's an ongoing challenge that we back and forth with them. So the FA, English football's been a huge area that our work's tackled and had impact in. Our research as well has contributed insight towards interventions towards professionalising coaching and leadership. British Cycling examples highlighted here. So our research highlighted the lack of transparency and knowledge as to the coaching pathway for women. Actually, I don't know it's there. I don't know how to get through. It's not clear. I don't have support when I'm on there. And the visibility is really poor for women. So those are some of the stories that we heard. So our research showcased the importance of having support networks and visibility and experienced coaches and mentors working collaboratively. And through that then, British Cycling put on the Ignite Your Coaching network, because previous to that they'd had 23 women on it. By the end of the program they only had one, so something wasn't going right. And to provide that further evidence, for example, is another example. We've worked with World Rugby. Our work was about, we have to have a talent development framework for our coaches in the same way that we do with our athletes, and a pathway for unions and regional associations. So our work was the basis of this review, this toolkit. We raised the issue around employment because, of course, it's one thing getting women qualified, but if there's no jobs for anyone to go into, that's raising expectations erroneously. So the research and the toolkit then led to the coaching internship program, which saw female coaches given 12-month placements opportunities within a World Cup team. And then that led to 6 national associations appointing a woman to their management team at the World Cup, which doubled the number of women coaches at rugby international levels for the last World Cup. Just briefly as well, so I'll go back. Our work has informed European Commission and Council policy, so it's underpinned the strategies at a European level. Is some of the most cited research in the workforce, in the strategy and the action planning. And then finally, this speaks to some of the stories that I've shared. Some of those stories were principally from athletics. I don't know if I was naive going into it, but it was only a small, relatively small study, small funding. It was about achieving gender equity, and some of the things that we unearthed, it was quite harrowing. And it just shows that it's not about how much money is attached to a project for you to have impact and do some really good quality research that can lead to change. This was work about making the environment safe for women to lead within. And this work highlighted the toxic and exclusive cultures within high performance coaching, which then led to, as a result, and because we had the CEO on our side, she created with the board the Gender Equity and Coaching Action Plan. So we have actions like gender equity is now a regular item reported at UKA board meetings. There's representation of women on the UK advisory panels. There's simple things like the publishing of team staff names upon announcement of the GB and Northern Ireland teams alongside their athletes. They've never done that before, which of course contributes to the invisibility of women. And it created the UKA Gender Equity and High Performance Endurance Coaching Project. Because of all those actions and the endorsement of the CEO, it led to the first time women represented on GB and Northern Ireland teams for the first time at a world stage. So for the World Indoor Championships was the first time we had women in those coaching teams. Because of all those changes that the governing body enacted. And it's even, for me, what's just as important is when I speak to the women, I'm still in touch with a lot of the women, how emotional they got in just hearing their name, hearing their stories, seen in the press, shared. So like, I've lived with this. I remember one coach, she said, I've been doing this sport for 30 years and I've never coached at this, I've never been asked to speak at this. And now suddenly that's all changed. And I was just amazed that she'd been doing this for 30 years in those conditions, really. So that's what gets me up in the morning and drives the work and the team. So just to bring this to a close, this is my final slide. Just some reflections, I guess, on the road behind me and the team and the road ahead. We often use the GROW model within our research, and what I find has changed over the course of the 16 years or so that I've been leading this work is a sense of reality. I think people are getting there in terms of understanding the issues. There's a greater will to address them. What we're not seeing, of course, then is the actions to match that. That still needs to change, but the reality, I think, the will to change, it's definitely there. Well, it was better than it was. It's a challenging space to work in. I was speaking to a colleague that works in children and coaching and sport, and he has doors opened for him. I often have doors shut on me, and it's really challenging conversations to have, because you feel like you're constantly having to defend why this work's important, but then you have to do that in a way that meets people where they are, and is non-judgmental where they are, what they're doing. Okay, where are you at? What are some of the issues, and how can we work with you to address that? Like I said, the challenge is towards social justice. I still think it's a phrase people are not quite using in the UK yet. So in that way, the centre is almost too far ahead of itself. But that's where we've got to get to. So we had recently a Safe Sport event here because we want to shift the focus on human rights as well as equity, participation, access and opportunity. It's got to be, like we said at the start, Helen, you said, to go to work and experience that is not okay. It's actually against human rights to go to work and be, I wouldn't expect it. And so we're expecting a lot of our coaches. And like I said, the purpose of what we're doing, the reality, the work has to be contextualised. So we really want to work within the sports to understand what is it about that sport that leads to the action, and then of course that will have a greater impact. And I've said it quite a lot about meeting people where they are, but within that, then where are the levers for change? Who do I need to speak to really pull on this lever for change? Not pull it in the wrong way, but really to have that deeper change, to have those key relationships. The relationships within our work is really important. We spend a lot of time building relationships, and sometimes they don't come to anything, and that's frustrating, but that's all part of it. And like I said, context is really key. If this work's going to land, it has to be based within that context of that sport. And this is just something I often say, that this is a long-term project. I'm never going to probably see it being addressed in my lifetime, and but we have to take a long-term approach to it, long-term thinking. In sport, we're stuck in these 4-year cycles of funding. That is changing, but we get stuck in these cycles, or I've got to spend the money in 6 months, so can you do something in 6 months? But actually, the impatience, I guess, is still there about I want this changed in 6 months. So we do have to adopt that longer term thinking. So that is I feel like I've talked quite a lot, and but that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the programme of research we're leading here in the centre. Feel free to get in touch with me anytime. Probably don't have space for questions now or of many, but I'm here, and please feel free to reach out anytime. And thank you again for hosting me this morning.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Thank you. It was fascinating, but a little bit depressing. But
I think I have to say that this is a bit like the dark side of sport, but this is what we need to challenge. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know people have got to go. Leanne, you might have to go too. But take Leanne's offer up if you've got any questions. That's really kind, Leanne, if you're happy to do that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks. It was really, really good.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Lovely to meet you all.
I'll stop the recording now as well.
Bye all.
Bye.
Thank you.